friends, I am back with another Yoga Basics class for you today. These are instructional videos that break down aspects of more traditional standard yoga poses. And today's category of poses is balance. And if you have done any of my classes before, you know that balance poses are my jam. Probably because I'm naturally pretty good at balance poses. They just come a little bit more easily to me than maybe some other people. And when you compare the aspect of balance with the other things that we work on in yoga, flexibility and strength, it may not always be clear as to why we don't have good balance. As opposed to being strong or being flexible, right? Those things it's a little bit more clear the issues involved with those two things. So I'll talk a little bit about some things that can affect your balance and help and give you some ways to work on tree pose, eagle, and dancer. So those are all standing one-legged balance poses. But in addition to just standing on one leg, there's lots of other stuff also happening to create the shape of the pose. So we'll talk about that as well. I am going to use a yoga block for a couple of different things, so have that handy. And I would also say if yoga poses are not your jam, like they are mine, you probably want to have something to hold on to just in case you start to lose your balance, which is completely normal. So maybe you're by the wall or a piece of sturdy furniture where you can have your hand on something for help. Okay, so we're gonna start with a little bit of warming up for the ankles and the feet, obviously because that's our foundation for our balance poses. So if you want to hang on to something for help with balance to start as we warm up, certainly feel free, grab hold of something. Just going to do a little bit of ankle rolling with each leg in both directions. And make sure you do both sides. Lift one foot and make some circles in both directions. All right. And then from here, we'll just sort of plant the feet and look down and see if we can get the toes to spread a little bit. You don't have to feel like you are overly spreading your toes, just like when we do work on our hands. You don't have to feel like you're overly spreading your fingers, but just enough to sort of cover some surface area and feel rooted and grounded. You might hang on to something for this one too. We're gonna kind of shift weight in the feet a little bit, more to the balls of the feet, and then roll to the outer edges, and then come to the heels, and then the inside edges, so you're circling around the edges of your feet. Switch directions with that little bit of circling. All right. From here, now that we've got the feet and the ankles a little bit more warmed up, one of the muscle groups that's really important for stability when you stand on one leg is our hip muscles. So we're going to work on that a little bit with the assistance of a block. Again, hang on to something if you want some balance help. So step one foot up onto your block, and then obviously we want it on the lowest setting and lengthwise so that you can get most of your foot on top of the block, depending on the size of your foot. I've got big feet. That's one of the things that I always kind of credit my good balance with, is just having a bigger foundation. I don't know if that actually makes a difference or not. So push down into that foot that's on the block. And we're gonna do a little bit of hip movement and see if we can feel how the glute muscles on the leg of the foot that's on the block work. So put your hands on your hips so you can have a little bit of awareness of what's happening. So we're gonna go from what I call like a sassy hip position. So my right foot's on the block. I'm gonna let the left hip kind of drop down, right? And you see how that's like a sassy hip cocked out to the side. And then as I go toward more of an even hip position, a strong hip position, right? I'm pushing down more firmly into the block. My other foot's lifting, my hips have evened out, and I can feel the glute muscles working all on that side. You can kind of go back and forth a little bit from sassy to strong. The name for this little action is hip list. Not something we necessarily think about all that much. But I do see a lot of sort of loosey-goosey standing legs sometimes when we're trying to stand on one leg because we're worried about the shape of everything else. And you really got to get your standing leg nice and strong if you're going to hold yourself up. Let's do that with the other side. And after doing several, right, you may start to feel that little glute burn, which is good. Sassy to strong. I like being sassy and strong, but not for balance poses. Gotta be strong. Right, you might start to feel a little bit of that muscle fatigue in the hip glute area. All right, I'm gonna step off that block from here. So one of the things that can affect your balance, other than maybe your foot size, like I said, I don't know if that's actually a thing, is your gaze. So you may see me lose balance a little bit as I am maybe looking down at what's going on or looking at my camera setup. So I'll try to remind you of that as we go through some of our balance poses. And one of the other things that a lot of my students claim affects their balance is the surface of the floor that they're standing on. So that's one thing that maybe you could experiment with. If you're standing on your yoga mat right now, maybe you step off to a harder surface. I have some students who will do that in class, step off of their mat onto the bare floor, and just maybe having less in the way helps them feel more rooted. The thing about that is, though, is that why are we even practicing balance poses? If you've done my classes before, some of my basics classes, for sure, I'm definitely more of a function over form kind of person when it comes to yoga in general, exercise in general. And when we're out in the world, we are not always going to be barefoot on a flat, bare floor when we are just going about whatever we're doing. And I really think the reason that we practice balance is so that we are not falling over, right? When we're just hiking or walking, or, you know, maybe we are in New York City and like trying to make it through a crosswalk before we get hit by a taxi. You can practice on some different floor surfaces, keeping that in mind, where if you only ever try to practice your balance poses on a floor, a bare floor, it may not serve you as well. So practice, you know, like we did on top of a block, on your mat, on a carpet. When you go out hiking, maybe step up on a rock and try a balance pose. All right, so let's move on to tree pose. So we've already talked about the hip muscles, that hip list action that needs to be in place for the standing leg. And that's gonna go for any balance pose, right? We need to have some awareness of the hip muscles working. What's going on with the rest of tree pose? The other knee is bent and the knee is abducted, right? It's away from the midline. So one of the ways that I like to practice this and prep for it within a class after feeling that engagement through the standing leg is to kind of abduct back and forth to get the hip moving in that direction before just kind of yanking it up into place. So you can do this with the ball of your foot down, right? So you're not balancing yet, so that you can get the shape of things before trying to take it into a balance pose. Sometimes I get a little bit evil and ask my students to do that with the leg lifted. And you can feel how much work that is. So try that on one side. And then there's lots of different ways that you can add the balance aspect. There's a lot of discussion about where to put your foot on your leg. And there's no one right place, right? It depends on what you're trying to get out of the pose. It used to be that, and I was taught this and I said it, I don't say it anymore because it's dumb and it doesn't have any basis in scientific evidence. We were always taught, do not put your foot right on your knee in tree pose. Like I said, there's no scientific evidence to back up that that's gonna be harmful for your knee. If you feel like that part of your knee where you might put your foot in tree pose hurts when you put your foot there in tree pose, of course, don't do that. But otherwise it's totally fine. And I'll kind of show you or demonstrate typically if you know, back in the day, if I wasn't going to put my foot on my knee in tree pose, I would use my hand to grab it and hike it up as high as I could, right? When I do that and I let go, I do feel a lot of pressure of the foot into the leg. So perhaps that's where that came from. Now, my grabbing hold of my foot and putting it up there, I got into tree pose passively instead of actively. If you've done my classes lately, you have experienced that I don't do that as much anymore. It's not that there's anything wrong with that, but I am not able to get my foot into that position on its own without using my hand. If I do it actively, and I just kind of slide it up until I can't do it anymore without help, that's my active position. And it's maybe just a little bit above my knee. I don't feel any pressure, actually, of the foot pushing into the leg. That's usually the way I do it now. One thing that you could consider is how the arch of your foot fits against your leg. And depending on the shape of your leg, I think that the arch of my foot fits really well, that curve, against that side of my calf muscle. And it also fits really well into the curve on the inside of my knee, right? It fits there perfectly. It's like it was made to be there, interestingly enough. If you are not ready to take your leg that high, no problem, you don't have to. One of the ways I will offer for my students who maybe have more difficulty with standing on one leg. After you do that practicing of your abduction, you could just take your heel against your leg, maybe you're holding on to something, and then try just barely lifting your toes. That way you don't have as far to fall if you can't keep your balance. You could also have that foot up on a block, right? You've got your leg higher, which if that makes you happy and is more aesthetically pleasing, then okay, right? Maybe you then, once it's lifted with the help of the block, then try to put it on your leg, right? So you've already given it some help to lift, so you don't have to do as much work to start. You could also use the wall, not just to hold on to, but you could put your tree knee against the wall, right? That way you're not actually hanging on with your hands, right? You're using the support of the wall in a different way, right? And then whatever you want to do with your arms in tree pose, you might see arms up, you might see hands in prayer. It's up to you, whichever feels good for you. If it doesn't feel good to take your arms up overhead, you don't have to. At least in my class, right? I'm kind of a have it your way kind of teacher. Make sure that you've done both sides to practice, starting with maybe a little bit of abduction, back and forth a few times. I always think of the movie Grease, where Sandy throws down her cigarette and says, "Tell me about it, stud," and she's putting out a cigarette. If you've seen any movie with a smoking scene, something or other, and they're putting their cigarette out, that's what this reminds me of, which is yucky, but there you have it. You could put your ankle, or your heel, against your opposite leg and just try lifting the toes. You can try it actively and compare sides, right? Lifting. You can try it passively by using your hand. And notice how that feels, right? To me, I really kind of feel the pressure pushing in, probably because, it's hanging on for dear life. And when I try to detach that, my foot doesn't stay. So my leg will not do that on its own. Whatever you want to do with your arms, right? Make sure that your gaze is steady, right? Like I said before, if you move your head around and move your eyes, you're gonna fall over. Typically in balance poses, I try to look, I would say just fairly straight ahead, maybe down my nose a little bit, depending on what you've got going on around you, right? If you are in a class with other people, seeing them moving is probably going to affect your balance as well. We've noticed lately, and I'm teaching a small number of live classes now, still during the COVID pandemic, and we're wearing masks, right? And having a mask on your face affects your vision and affects your balance. There you have it. Okay, so that's pretty much tree pose, right? So let's move on to eagle. I love eagle. I love all balance poses, you know that already. I really love eagle, probably because I also love chair pose, which you may or may not know. And chair pose is the base position for eagle, and typically where I get to eagle from in a class. So the knees are bent, hips are back, etc. So we'll break down it separately what the legs are doing, and then what the arms are doing, and then we'll put them together. So one of the things about eagle that is difficult, I think, for people is trying to wrap the legs. Now, depending on your legs, how they're built, etc., right, that may be trickier. So one of the things I find helpful is to try to cross things over as high as possible so that I'm not just doing that, right? I have lifted and tried to get that leg higher up, if that makes sense, right? So you might practice it that way, kind of going back and forth. Chair pose base, crossing. You can do this hanging on to something for balance help since you're lifting, but lift that leg high and then cross it over, right? That way you'll make more space. You do a little dance there. While you're practicing that, here's another thing to notice. Remember we talked about hip list, the activation through the glutes on the standing leg. So because eagle has chair pose as a base instead of straight-legged standing pose, bent knee balance pose, sometimes that's a little bit trickier to feel. And sometimes what I see is a sassy hip kind of thing with the crossed over leg, that hip dropping. And the opposite leg is the standing leg, and that's where we want to feel that hip list, even out your hips, right? So as you cross over, don't let that hip collapse. Find that hip list. One of the ways that you might assist yourself, if your body proportions make it so, your leg length, etc., how far you're bending your knees and your leg length will affect how far away from the floor your foot is, the lifted one. So just like in tree pose, I said you could keep your foot low, right, so you have not as far to fall. You could step onto a block, right, so you've already got some lift there, and then try to lift. That's one way. If you don't need the block, right, you can just put your toes down, right? If they don't reach, you could have a block there to bridge the gap. And that's just that's a body proportion thing, and there's not much you can do about that, right? After you get your leg wrapped, crossed, you can just lift your toes. The quote unquote full expression of the leg part is to also wrap the foot behind the other leg, which makes things more wobbly. And if you think about what's required for that, it's a lot of flexibility for the top of the foot, right? If it's gonna wrap behind and kind of like your toes wrap around that opposite leg, foot flexibility is a big issue there. That's one of the things that comes more naturally to me. When we go through the flow to kind of put the poses together, that's one thing we will address. So know that that's an issue. Know that you don't also have to wrap your foot, right? If that doesn't feel good, if that doesn't work for you, that's okay. Okay, so that's the leg portion. And then, as if that weren't enough, we are also trying to wrap the arms in the same manner. And a lot of things can come into play when we're trying to wrap the arms. Just like the shape of your legs, the shape of your body, etc., can affect how you wrap your legs. Same thing with the arms. And sometimes it's, like if you do a lot of weightlifting and you have prominent arm muscles or even pec muscles, right? That things can get in the way of wrapping. If you have tightness in your upper back around the shoulder blades, that can affect how well you can bring your arms out in front of you and get them crossed. So I would say to prep for that, doing a little bit of movement for the shoulder blades, and you can do that arms forward and just sort of reach them forward, reach them back, so the shoulder blades are spreading apart and drawing together. And then you could practice that, and this is a way that I do a lot in my classes, to prep for eagle arms. You can do sort of a similar thing, but with cactus shape. Bring them back, and then bringing them forward. Feeling again the shoulder blades spread as you do that. Bring them forward and feeling them draw together as you bring your arms back. So from that forward position, try one elbow on top, right? And in order to make more space, just like with the legs, lift it high, wrap it high, same thing with the arms. And maybe it feels a little bit weird doing it from this forearms forward position. One of the ways I will offer my students to just have as an option instead of that eagle wrap is a hug. It's also a good prep for wrapping, and you can really make a little bit more space by trying it that way, right? And then you might go up from there. You might be able to bring the palms of your hands together. Aesthetically, I have always done palms together, fingers up. I like the energetic feeling of that as well, right? Sort of a lifted feeling. Does it matter? Not necessarily. And just like you may not wrap your feet, you don't necessarily have to wrap your hands, right? Just go as far as it feels appropriate for you to go, depending on what's going on with your body. And when we put those two things together, the legs and the arms, you might see in different styles of yoga, say you've got your right leg on top. You might see some styles of yoga where the right arm is on top also, or on the bottom. Does it matter? No. But how could that really matter? It just depends on what you're trying to get out of your position, and hopefully you just make sure that you switch sides for both when you do the other side. For me, I prefer to do whichever leg is on top, that's my bottom arm, because it makes our brains work a little bit harder when we do different things with opposite sides of the body. And to me, that's worthwhile. So if that's worthwhile to you, you might also choose to do opposite arm and leg, top to bottom for eagle. Probably it's easier to get the arms first and then the legs, because you'll still have both feet on the floor. So that could be one thing as you practice your balance in eagle, is to practice getting the arms in place first, finding your chair base. I've got my right arm on top, so I'll do my left leg on top, lift high, and cross over. And vice versa. That's eagle. And you'll see eagle arms and eagle legs done separately in some different locations and some different positions. I like to add eagle stuff to a lot of different places. So the next one we'll do now is dancer. Dancer pose goes back to the tree pose standing leg because we're not bending the knee. We have a straight leg balance pose. Dancer pose is also a back bend, right? So like I mentioned, for these balance poses, there's a lot going on, right? We've got a leg behind us instead of in front of us or out to the side, right? So that's an issue. We've got an arm helping, right? And just like I said in tree pose, doing it passively versus actively. We can try that in dancer as well. So let's do a little bit of rotation with the arms to open up through the shoulders so that we can hopefully be able to grab our foot. Standard alignment in the way that I practice dancer is with an externally rotated arm from the shoulder. So the palm faces out. If you have tighter shoulders, that's going to affect how well you can grab your foot. That's the arm part. The foot part, we're bending a knee and bringing a foot up, and hopefully we can reach the hand to the foot. Sometimes I will make my students attempt to, after we've done some rotating with the arms, bring the foot to the hand. Now, obviously, body proportion will affect that, right? I have long arms, so I can reach things a little bit easier than some folks. So if you don't have long arms, that's gonna be harder for you. There's not a whole lot you can do about that, right? You can't grow your arms longer, even though I joke about that with some of my students. So you might practice just kind of seeing how that goes, back and forth, seeing what happens there. You might feel, as you bend your knee and lift your foot, you might feel your hamstring muscles, right back of the thigh, which makes perfect sense because that's the muscle that's doing the work when we flex the knee and lift the foot like that. So that's a good thing. And it's good to practice it without just grabbing hold and lifting it for it, right? Making it work on its own, because it'll get stronger and more able, right? So external rotation, got some hammy work. Lift the foot. I can feel those hammies working, right? I'll take the other arm up. All right, and here's where I'll say, okay, let's start to add our back bend, right? So think about all of the other back bends that we do in yoga, and there's a ton, right? Camel, upward bow, up dog, locust, cobra, etc. All of those poses, the hips are square forward, right? Maybe we're face down, maybe we're face up, maybe we're kneeling, but we're not turning the hips. So for dancer pose, I tend to treat it as a hip square forward pose. However, it's hard to do when you're standing on one leg. So I'm just offering that little bit of information. It doesn't necessarily mean that the world's gonna end if you let that lifted hip open a little bit. It probably feels easier. So depending on your intention of what you wanna get out of the pose, you could make it easier by letting the hip open, or make it more challenging by not, right? You can hang onto a wall as well with the opposite hand. Walking the hand up, right? Letting the hand assist. You can practice it passively as well, right? Letting go and seeing if you can maintain your dancer leg. And for most of us, we're not gonna maintain the same amount of lift when we let go, just like I did demonstrating in tree pose, right? And that's normal and fine. Another thing that you will see some differences in dancer, depending on the style of yoga, is how far forward you're leaning. There's no black or white, right or wrong answer. I prefer dancer as a little bit more of an upright pose as opposed to a forward pose, but there's a little bit of counterbalancing going, right? With your leg behind you and your chest forward. So play around with that and see how that feels. Warrior 3 is a balance pose that's very far forward, right? So because of that, because I have that to work on, that aspect of balance, maybe that is why I don't do dancer too far forward. I keep it a little bit more upright. Yeah. Now, this external rotation with the arms, if it's too much for you to do that, and you want to try reaching with an internal rotation of the arm and reach for the outside of your foot instead, is it wrong? It's not traditional. Try it both ways and see if that makes a difference for you. Yeah, that's dancer. It's a really pretty pose, right? Check your gaze. Make sure that you're not looking down so things don't go down. So now I'm gonna do a little bit of a flow. We're gonna do a little bit of warming up flow and then kind of put those poses together. The flow between balance poses is very tricky when you're standing on one leg, right? So just be aware. And we're gonna come on down and do a little bit of cat-cow on our hands and knees. I like to move my feet back and forth in cat-cow. You'll see differences of that from styles of yoga as well. But again, we talked about how foot flexibility comes into play with some of these poses. So you might tuck your toes for cow and flatten your feet for cat. And speaking of feet, let's tuck the toes and give them a little bit of a stretch by sort of kind of pressing into that toe tuck. And then let's release the toes and we'll do pointed toes, tops of the feet down to give the tops of the feet and the ankles a little bit more of a stretch. And this will definitely help us with eagle if we're trying to wrap those toes behind. If you want more stretch here, hands could be down and you could try lifting your knees. All right, and from here to get our spines a little bit more warmed up for dancer, our back bend balance pose. We're gonna come to our bellies, hands near the chest. Shoulders roll down and back, elbows hug in, and we'll do a little bit of baby cobra lifting. These are, these face down prone back bends are really my favorite category of back bends because they really help to strengthen our backs. Let's hold that baby cobra and then lift the legs and hopefully feel those glutes working, which we'll need in our balance poses as well. And then let's reach the arms back, and you might do a little bit of rotation practice there as well for dancer. you wanted to kind of bend the knees, like we did that practice for dancer with the leg, you could. All right, let's rest for a moment. And then we'll take it up into downward facing dog. And let's step the feet forward to the top of the mat, hang in an easy fold for a moment. And then we'll come on up to standing to begin our flow. All right, so settling into mountain pose, you might look down at your feet, make sure that things are well planted, spreading the toes. All right, let's reach both arms up overhead. And then we'll lift the left knee just out in front. And then we'll abduct that leg out for tree pose, and you can touch your standing leg with your foot or just kind of keep it out to the side. Knee back forward. And then we'll lower the knee and bring it back behind us as we circle the left hand back and find it maybe for dancer. Get a little bit more lifted, right? Maybe the foot lifts. Maybe we tilt forward a little bit. Let's make it an active dancer. Let go. Left arm forward. Bend your opposite knee as well. And we're going to bring that leg forward and find our eagle wrap. Lift the leg high to wrap. Opposite arm on top. So left leg on top, left arm under. Hopefully feeling chair pose as our base. Hopefully not being too sassy with the hips. Let's release to chair. And then switch sides for eagle. Right leg on top, right arm under. You can do a hug. You can do the arms first. Let's take this into dancer, standing on the left foot this time. Let's make it active, let go. And then we'll bring that right knee forward, knee out, tree. Knee back forward, foot down, mountain pose. Woo! You may notice, I noticed, heart rate got up, breathing was hard, and we were moving slowly. That's definitely a thing with balance poses for me. I'm gonna repeat that sequence, but start staying on the left foot. Arms reach up. Right knee lifts forward. Abduct out to the right for tree. You can just hang out or touch your leg. Knee forward. Lower it down, circle the right arm back. Find your foot for dancer. Back bend. Maybe tilt forward. Make it active, let go. Both arms forward. Bend the standing leg. Bring it forward to wrap it for eagle. Right leg on top, right arm under. Release to chair. Switch sides for eagle. Unwrap, find dancer. Make it active, let go. Bring that left knee forward. Abduct for tree. Knee forward, foot down, mountain pose. Woo! All right, I'm officially worn out. So, balance poses are hard, and hopefully you maybe learn some ways that you can get a little bit better, work on them, put them together. And like I said, you'll see lots of balance poses in many of my classes. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to practicing with you again soon. Namaste.